Okay, let's try to stay on track this time so this doesn't take too long. At first, when I wanted to do this video, I wanted to talk about a couple of ions in the body, and then I was like, well, crap. I can't just talk about calcium and magnesium and phosphate, although those are important. I was like, I kind of have to talk about sodium, kind of have to talk about potassium. And I was like, oh boy, well then I got to talk about hydrogen. And then I was like, well, then I guess I should probably talk about the pH and bicarbonate buffering system. And now we're on this whole entire tangent, and I suppose that the best way to do it is to talk about the body in general, pH, and why ions are so important together, and then break each one down. So this is going to be a multi-part little mini-series. I hope all these videos are, I'm aiming for 30 minutes or less, but it's probably going to be more like 45. Caveat, last week I had talked about succinylcholine stimulating or agonizing nicotinic sub-M for muscle receptors, and then I made had the idea that, wouldn't that make sense if your fasciculation dose and then desensitized for the rest of it? But like, what about when the body starts metabolizing it, and then its half-life, and then it's secreted until the point where only 10% is left again? Would you get more fasciculations? And I didn't do any research, and I'm probably not going to. However, I did ask a nurse anesthetist and an anesthesiologist a couple of days ago if they've ever seen multiple occurrences of fasciculations after the first set, and the answer to that was no. So I don't really think I need to do much research. To me, it kind of made sense that might be possible to have happen as it crosses the threshold again. But I think the half-life is so quick that by the time it's over, the cells probably aren't even fully, I don't know. Anyways, not worth exploring, but I can just attest that from expert witness, or whatever you want to call it, expert consultation, that they have never seen multiple occurrences of fasciculations, nor do you ever give succinylcholine more than once due to the risk of hyperkalemia. So therefore, just a caveat for my last video. So today, I think the easiest way to do this is to break it up into cations and anions. Cations, which have positive charges, and then anions, which have negative charges. The reason this is important, because if you divide this right in half, and I'm going to give you some examples of each one of these, and then what I will do is I'll just give a brief example of one reason why they're important, but I'm not going to dwell on each one of these in particular, but I will focus on hydrogen today. So, positive. Magnesium. I mean, there's a lot more elements than this, but I'm going to give like the big ones. Calcium. Sodium. Potassium. What else? I guess hydrogen. Hydrogen's kind of on a class of its own, and I'll explain why. Anions, you've got chloride, phosphate, that's also negative, obviously. What else do we have? Lactic acid, or lactate, ketones, albumin. That's an important molecule that a lot of people don't, not that they don't consider it, maybe it's considered a little bit too late. And I know when I was doing my initial entry programs, I never learned about albumin, and I kind of wish that I had, because it's very important for water. And then, yeah, I guess water, I mean, it's kind of both, but so I'll draw water in the middle. Because it's very amendable to change. The other thing that's amendable to change is bicarbonate and the acid's buffering system. So carbonic acid is in the middle. That is H2CO3. And this is a two-way reaction, where it could go either way depending on the needs of the body, and it's very easily transitionable back and forth. It doesn't really require much energy to do these. versus sending sodium and potassium through a sodium-potassium pump in the heart, for example, requires the use of ATP, and then you also have to replenish that energy. So when you have hydrogen and then bicarb, positive and negative, see, becoming carbonic acid. Which then dissociates into H2O, which we know is just water, and CO2. And we can breathe out CO2. Breathe out. So here's a couple of examples of why these are all important. Magnesium, cell signaling. Metabolism, right? There's over 300 signaling cascade events that utilize magnesium in at least one of the steps in the process. Super important. And then in my last videos I said calcium causes contraction and magnesium mitigates, because magnesium is a smooth muscle relaxer and calcium opposes that, and then it's used in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then you get these actinomyosin filaments, and then when calcium binds, they rotate, they attach to each other, and they pull in, and bam, you get a muscle contraction. And it's that way throughout the body. Sodium, potassium, talk about in general, together. Heart conduction, but nerve excitability. Heart conduction, nerve excitability. Really any neuron firing is going to use, well, acetylcholine and dopamine and those other neurotransmitters, but sodium and potassium are really important in maintaining and changing gradients so that action potentials occur. And then hydrogen, I kind of talked about that down here. One, it's part of water, and then it's part of the buffering system. And what's unique about water? Well, take all of these elements and decide which one would be the easiest to go to and from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. So you have this phospholipid bilayer, and in order to get sodium and potassium through, for example, you need sodium-potassium pumps, and those require energy because they're going against their concentration gradient to create enough of a difference in polarity on one side versus the other that it propagates an action potential and the cell reacts to it. So, but all of these, well, for the most part, the majority of the cells in the body are hydrophilic, so they like water. And obviously you have some fat cells that are not that way, but a lot of medicine that we give patients are hydrophilic. Some are hydrophobic, some are lipophilic. But hydrogen in a water permeable membrane, hydrogen is just part of H2O, and so is an oxygen. So you can imagine that oxygen and hydrogen are diffusing across the membrane, not really freely, but it doesn't take energy per se to get them to go across the concentration gradient to equalize one side or the other. So that's why it's so important. It's a very transferable ion, way more so than these other ones. So when you ask the question, if you've got a stabilized charge on one side of the cell versus the other, it doesn't matter which element you move, but if you have to make the positivity the same as it was before, what's the easiest ion to move? It's going to be hydrogen. And an example that I could use for this is, like, let's say you have a door, but it's only a small door. It's 4 feet tall and it's 1.5 feet wide. And you have to have 100 people on this side and 100 people on this side. And if some of your people are 7 feet tall, 350 pounds, and some of them, maybe they're 5-year-olds and they're like 3.5 feet tall and they only weigh 70 pounds, what one's going to move through the door to make, let's say a bunch of people get added to the side and now you have 110? Well, to equalize this, you need 5 to go from here to here. That way this number would be 105 and this number would be 105. It would probably take the big person a lot of energy to crouch down, go through this door. Maybe they get stuck and they have to squeeze, and the fire department has to come, and pull them through or whatever. But these ones, these hydrogen atoms, the little 5-year-olds, can just kind of freely go through because they're not too big to fit through the door. That's the analogy. Give a couple examples of what these anions do. Chloride, you've probably heard of sodium chloride, which is table salt. Chloride is just the main or the principal cation in the extracellular space. Anion. Which means it's more responsible than all the other ones put together for balancing the positivity of this side. Phosphate, you've probably heard of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, energy production. So phosphate is used in energy, metabolism, cell signaling. Lactate's produced when you use muscle cells. I would suppose you probably wouldn't produce much lactate if you're just laying in bed breathing, but if you're like running or anything like that, you're going to produce lactate, and then it's usually cleared by, the liver and the kidneys. So lactate, also a byproduct of energy at times. Ketones, same thing, depending on what your blood sugar is. If you have diabetes or don't have diabetes, but even if you don't have diabetes, everybody's got a little bit of ketones running around. If you wake up and your house is on fire and you haven't eaten anything for 14 hours, you still got to run out of the house. It's probably going to produce some lactate, and you probably have some ketones from the sudden use of muscles without, and just woke up from a dead sleep. And albumin is the main, so energy production here. And albumin is the main oncotic gradient player. So just like planets, albumin is big, so it attracts water to a larger extent than smaller ions do, and it's just due to the pull because of its size. So when you talk about fluid balance and diet and the gut, albumin becomes really important. So why is all this important together? I'll do some videos about each one of these specifically, but today we're going to focus on hydrogen, the body's pH in the buffering system, and then the other side of it, positive and negative sides. So what is the body's pH? It's 7.35 to 7.45. And if you remember from science class that the pH ranges from, with the perfect middle being 7, 0 to 14. This is alkalotic. Alkalosis. I'm sorry. Acidotic. Acidotic, TIC? Acidotic, DIC? Acidic. I'm bad at spelling today. And then this is alkalotic. And then 7's right in the middle. Neutral. Not really going to waste your time with examples of what basic substances are versus like baking soda or like lemon juice or something. But the point is that when you add up all of the cations, the positive charges on one side and the negative on the other side, they should cancel each other out. I can't really tell you why the body chooses to operate between 7.35 and 7.45. Maybe that's just a process of our evolution. So it has shifted a little bit away from being perfectly neutral. And so why is that? So if you picture there being columns, that are the same size, because all the anions and cations cancel each other out in the body as a whole number. The primary cation is sodium. And these are called, oh boy, what's the name of them? They're large, crap, I'll remember in a second. strong ion. The difference, the strong ion difference, SiD. Chloride. But what else? Bicarb. Which I guess I'm going to add that over here. And then right here, these are anion gap things, because we're on the anion side, and it's filling in the gap. What's left to make neutrality? What's left up here? Well, it's everything else. Calcium, hydrogen, magnesium, and then I don't know what else is positive, but yeah, I don't know, zinc, copper, you name it, all in smaller degrees. So, you know, out of the dollar, this one's maybe using 80 cents of it, versus these ones maybe only fractions of a penny. But if you get enough of them, they do make a little bit of difference over time. So it's kind of important, I guess, to pay attention to. And probably the reason why there's not a lot of them is because there's one specific part of the body that's very, very susceptible to its presence. And if you had too much, like you do sodium, then it would probably desensitize that cell signaling pathway. So just because they're small in number doesn't mean that they're not important. Arguably, the smaller they are, they play a very, very niche role in making a smaller function occur, but that smaller function is probably important. So, how, when you add all these up, there's this thing called a strong ion gap. Now, an important thing to know is that with any kind of thing like this, if your water balance changes, then your concentrations change. If you've got a 10 by 10 foot room with 10 people in it, boop, and you walk in there, you're going to run into a person approximately every foot. But if you lose water, aka become more dehydrated, and now you have a 5 by 5 foot room, but you still have those 10 people in there, you're now going to run into somebody every half of a foot. So this is more concentrated, but there's still the same amount of people, but this is what we call relative. So when you're doing these equations, if there's under or over hydration, then you have to take that into account, and that's beyond the scope of this video because it's just a complicated formula that it pretty much is just worth Googling. And before Google, it was probably written down on people's notes and textbooks and stuff that they could reference. Because you would take into consideration the relative concentration of everything compared to the fluent status, and that would be its corrected concentration. So you'd have a true concentration, then its corrected concentration. We're going to ignore that for the purpose of this video, but in general, it is good to know that if you get alterations in your numbers, and you're like, whoa, the sodium's really low, but then you find out that your hematocrit is also really low, you know, the percentage of water that's in the blood, that maybe that's why. Maybe when you correct the water deficit, the hyperconcentration of sodium would also fix itself. So we don't want to make corrections to electrolytes impulsively if there are fluid deficits or fluid problems to fix first. So when you add all of these up, we're going to take the strong ions, so the ones that make the most amount of difference when added up together. So the big players are sodium. Oops, I forgot one. I like to include this because this is probably, out of all of these, the most deadly when it increases. It's potassium, because it has a very strong effect on the heart, and it'll stop the heart if you have too much potassium in your blood. So let's actually include both of these. The average sodium is 135 to 145. Now if it's 146 or 134, we'll probably let the body fix that on its own, but if it's 115, then we might have to do something. So we're going to call this 140. And then, I don't know if it's like 3 to 5.5 maybe, so we're going to call the potassium 4. We're going to call the chloride maybe like 108. anywhere from like 98 to 108, 99, 98 to 110, something like that. Probably don't want it to go much above 110, depending on your lab parameters. Bicarb's generally 22 to 26, so we'll call it 24. And now I do have to explain something that's a little bit confusing. Bicarb, HCO3. You have to remember this. When you are reading an ABG, arterial blood gas, that is going to be listed as CO2 on there. I really do not know why, and I don't care. But the CO2 on an ABG is the bicarb. So when you see a CO2 of 22, that is not a reflection of what their end tidal would be. That is their bicarb, and that value would be normal, potentially, for that patient. Anion gap is everything else. So this is not included in the strong ion difference. What is included are these and the chloride. So add them up together. 140 plus 4. 144. Minus 108. What does that equal? Quick math. 36. Generally speaking, if your strong ion difference, now remember I said if your fluid was had deficits or there's too much derangements, I guess. If your fluid level was abnormal, you need to make corrections because this could be, because this is all amount of molecules per deciliter, and even if you have the same amount of molecules, if you have less fluid, this number could be higher, right? It would be higher. So on average, if this is between 35 and 40, you're pretty okay. That's considered normal. Normal. Now let's do an example of when this wouldn't be normal. Let's say your sodium is 160 and your chloride is still 108. What's that strong ion difference? 160 minus 108. 52. That's clearly not within this range, right? So what does that mean? Is that an alkalosis or an acidosis? A strong ion acidosis or a strong ion alkalosis? Well, this is an alkalosis, and I'll explain why. Let's just talk about what happens with hydrogen, and let's explain what an acid and a base is, and then we'll revisit that example. An acid and a base. Anything that when it's done dissociating or shifting from one side to the other in the body, anything that produces more hydrogen ions is an acid. And since it's a negative logarithmic scale to the negative power, the pH goes down. Acid. More hydrogen is an acid. Anything that when it dissociates leads to less hydrogen is a base, which means your pH goes up. So let's see. What would happen? When I drew those columns, this is the blood. This is not the cells. This is what's in the serum. If you had sodium here and hydrogen here, let's just say you only had hydrogen here just for the simplicity of this, and then this was chloride and this was all normal. Well, you don't need to put anything over here because this side's all set. This column's good. The negative side. That wouldn't happen anyways because this is anions, that's cations. If you increase the sodium, take this line you draw it up there. Well, where does the hydrogen go? It can't go over here because it's not an anion. Where can it go other than the blood to make the blood stay normal? Because the blood is what reaches the cells, and that's what delivers the things that it needs to for the cell to function. Well, it's going to go into the interstitial space, and then it's going to slowly go into the cells, and the cells are going to collect excess hydrogen as best as they can. you know, storage, backup generator, right? So in blood, we just decreased the hydrogen ions. That means it's a base. So, because when we did our numbers, our additions of the strong acid only, we said 160 minus 108 was 52. That is greater than 35 to 40. And since the amount of hydrogen ions is now less, because even though there's more sodium charges, remember I said we still have to maintain perfect neutrality in the body, in the blood. So this still has to be 7.35, but you get my point. No matter what, this still has to be 7.35 to 7.45. So we went down on our hydrogen ions to make space for all the extra sodium. Now, if this was due to a fluid problem, and then you corrected the fluid, this probably wouldn't even be an issue because this number would probably be artificially high as well, and then the net difference would still be 35 to 40. But let's say your fluid's good, and for some reason you truly did have more sodium than you were supposed to. You were actually hypernatremic. Strong ion difference of 52. You would just say they have a strong ion acidosis. And that's all you'd have to say. Likewise, if you went up on chloride, what's got to give here? Some sort of anion does. And what's the easiest anions to move back and forth? It's hydrogen, and then that whole bicarb buffering system, because it's all hydrogen, carbon, and water. Those are a lot easier to move than magnesium, sodium, and potassium. So it's easier then to put bicarb over to this side to make space for the excess chloride. Let's draw that formula. Hydrogen plus hydrogen, CO3, this is bicarb, becomes carbonic acid, becomes CO2 plus H2O. Now this is not the ABG CO2, this is actual CO2. When you shift bicarb from here to make room for the excess chloride, you went up in chloride, right? Let's say chloride is now 120, and this is the same. Like normal, let's say it's 140. What's that strong? Well, you know what, screw it. Let's add the potassium in there too, because I said I like to include it. So 144 minus 120. What's that equal? That's 16. It's less, far less than 35 to 40. And why is that an acidosis? Because when you make room for all the excess chloride that you're adding here, bicarb's going to go somewhere. Where is it going to go? It's going to move based on this formula. So we just took bicarb out of the blood, and then, because it's got to move, and we combined it to hydrogen. I'm sorry. No, we didn't. Let me think about this for a second. You're decreasing your bicarb to make room for the excess strong anion. And when you remove bicarb, what's left? Just hydrogen. Took away this. You can't, when this goes away, to get this on this formula, you'd have to go this way to get more bicarb. You dissociate this, you'd become hydrogen and bicarbonate, but we're getting rid of bicarbonate. So what by proxy goes up then? The free hydrogen. That went up. And we said that when you have more hydrogen, you have an acid. Okay? So you took away bicarb to make room for this chloride. And now hydrogen's not going to be able to bind to it because it went away into the cells. So the relative concentration of hydrogen has just gone up, because this is now more prevalent than all the other components. You can't put this on this side. This equation doesn't work well when there's not as much bicarb. So that is called a strong ion alkalosis or acidosis. Let's just summarize that real quick because it was a lot. Strong ions, the ones that make up the majority of the weight, the total, like the majority of the constituents in the cell, in the blood, in the serum, make up your strong ion. That difference should be about 35 to 40. Let's say it's about 40. Well, what takes care of that remaining 40? The bicarb buffering system. That takes care of it. So you can see, since we favor the plus side a little bit more than this side, we're not at a perfect 7. We're kind of up here, 7.35, 7.45. But we got this bicarb system that, even though our pH is 7.35 to 7.45, still maintains the positive and negatives perfectly in line. Positive for every negative. When you add something over here, it's displacing hydrogen. Hydrogen's got to go. So you have less hydrogen in the blood. Less hydrogen is a base. Likewise, increase this. Got to make space. Bicarb now leaves the blood. And if you take bicarb away, you're left with more hydrogen that can't bind to anything to go to the side of the equation. So relatively speaking, the hydrogen went up. And you got yourself an acid. Sorry. So a good one is hyperchloremia, or hyperchloremic acidosis. So if you give somebody sodium chloride, which is perfectly 154 millimoles or whatever of sodium and 154 millimoles of chloride, the strong ion difference in these two is 0. So on your scale from 0 to 80, let's say, with 40 being normal in the middle, did you put yourself that way or did you put yourself that way? Well, if you're pumping stuff that's on the left end of the scale into the patient, it's going to bring this value closer towards 0 the more you give. So when you give some of these already acidotic patients 10 liters of fluid, you've also added a hyperchloremic acidosis on top of their already existing acidosis, and their pH is going to go down even more because you've displaced more bicarb. Now there's less bicarb to bind with the hydrogen, so now there's more hydrogen in the blood. Like I said here, more hydrogen is an acid. So why is this important? Let's think about it in terms of a tug of war. Have 7.4, your pH, be the middle line where you're trying to get the other team to cross. And let's say you have 100 players on the side and 100 players on the side. If you lose, one player from, you're like 2 players from the side, and now you have 98, this side has 100, you're going to go a little bit this way, just a little bit. But your bicarb system's like, hang on, 98, 100, added together is 198, divided by 2 is 99. I'm going to kick a player over. I'm going to kick a bicarb over. So now you have 99 on this side and 99 on this side. Equal again. That's what the buffering system does, but it's only to a point. You don't have unlimited bicarb. Your kidneys are responsible for producing it when you're running low, but it takes time. So for the split-second need of the body, the bicarb, it's only produced in so much that's available for use in the body. So when you get these derangements that are super, super far apart, then it becomes harder for the body to adapt. So instead of having 90 players to 110, maybe you've got like 40 players to like 160. That's really going to pull it this way. What if you only had 10 players and then here he had 200. That's such a difference that like you're gonna pull when this team pulls. These guys are gonna or girls are gonna smack on their faces, and it's gonna be catastrophic. That's equivalent to death. Now, this is important because sometimes external factors, when patients become more and more unstable, can make the patient code, right? Like let's say your external factor is you put the patient into a cold ambulance and they were in their 80-degree house. That could kill your patient. You bumped them up and down a little bit too rough going up and down the stairs. You put them on the stretcher and you went over a big bump and their head was up and they went like that. I mean, maybe that's like, maybe you only have 2 people hanging on over here for dear life. You have 200 people over here hanging on, and these people are doing all they can just to not die. And then an external factor, i.e. an earthquake, comes, and it's enough to wiggle the floor in the gymnasium, i.e. the body, that they're just like, nope, can't do it anymore. And then your patient goes into cardiac arrest. So use that as an example. So when we're shifting this from one side to the other, the farther over to one side that we go, the more unstable or destabilized the cells become. And you can equate this gym to a cell. Every single cell has their own little game of tug of war going on. And if cell after cell after cell is being pulled more and more towards the acidic side, then they're just not going to function as well. If somebody said, hey, how's that game going in there? The person would be like, oh, it's a bloodbath, man. It's 2 versus 100. It's a bloodbath. So they're like, oh man, I don't want to watch that. I'm just gonna shut the game off. We're gonna throw in the towel and call it quits. Well, that cell just died. So when you have these massively unstable balances in hydrogen, it's the same principle. The whole entity is just destabilized, which means every function from that point on until it's fixed is gonna not function like it should. If your pH is only 7.3, you could probably still digest some food and walk around. 6.9, probably not even going to be conscious, right? So these patients that are near death or peri-arrest or even coded, you probably want to give them bicarb. But as a general principle, you don't want to give bicarb just to fix acidosis. You want to fix the underlying problem and then let other things correct themselves and then do supportive care. So you'd want to correct fluid abnormalities, electrolyte imbalances, fix the underlying infection, things like that. If the patient's almost dead or dying, then you got to give them something that'll rapidly fix it, or else, it doesn't really matter, they're going to be dead. So I suppose, to summarize this part, this is just why hydrogen and all of these combination of ions, both positive and negative, are so important, because they all work in tandem to create a stable game of tug of war. And when you make derangements on one side, or you horribly shift fluids, it's just not going to function the way that it should, because you took players away. Or instead of playing in a big gymnasium, now you're only playing in a small bedroom, but you got the same amount of people. Well, how are they all going to fit? They're not, right? So just kind of use the same logic there. So that's one way to get an acidosis. Strong ions. The other way is an anion gap. And I suppose there could technically be a cation gap, but it's so uncommon because most of the patients that we see have acidosis. But let's just draw our beakers one more time, our little columns here. I suppose, for whatever reason, you gave your person a ton of calcium. This person would probably die before the hypercalcemia actually caused a pH derangement. They might die for another reason, like cardiac irritability or an arrhythmia, or some other type of issue with actual muscle contraction. Maybe their diaphragm wouldn't work. But just humor me with this example, right? Let's say you did add a ton of magnesium. Those would that would displace hydrogen out of the blood. So giving somebody any of these elements in excess would theoretically cause and at least some degree of alkalosis. Your body might be able to recover from it using just its bicarb system. But the point is, what's somebody that might have derangements in these in general? People with dietary issues, people that don't eat well, people that have ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, malnourished people, people with cancers and tumors, people with eating disorders, but then also your patients in your ICU that just can't eat because they're intubated, for example. So you got to watch these ions in those patients, and you got to watch their fluid, because you could, just by having them become hypo or hyper of whatever level, because they're not getting enough in their diet, they could have derangements in their pH. Not that you worked so hard just to get them to not die, and then you forgot about this stuff and it's gone and it goes unchecked for a couple of days. Yeah, probably no bueno, right? So let's talk about the more common, which is anion gap, AG. And you can use the mnemonic mud piles to remember this. I don't remember what every single letter stands for. Look it up on your own. We've got like methanol or alcohol, uremia, so the kidneys don't work, and then toxins that are supposed to be secreted in your urine build up in the body. I don't know what D stands for. Diabetes, maybe? Ketones. P, yep, don't remember that one either. I, don't remember. L, lactic acid. Lactate. These are all negatively charged things. Aspirin, salicylates, maybe that's what the S is. Yeah, so when you get all these things adding up here, and then you do your Chem7 and you run your blood test, and you're like, well, boy, the sodium's normal, the potassium's normal, the chloride's normal, the fluid's okay, their hematocrite's 55, it's not, the fluid level's okay. How else did I displace bicarb from this side? Bicarb left. Now bicarb's not in the blood as much as it was. So on this side of the equation, H plus HCO3. Well, you just went down in your bicarb. So now you've got more hydrogen that can't go to this side of the equation. So you increased your hydrogen. So what did you do? Negative logarithmic scale. You just caused an acidosis. And all these things are normal, and then your basic complete metabolic panel probably will have some of these. It'll definitely have calcium, maybe magnesium on it, but that's why you got to investigate. If you got an alkalosis, I'd investigate this side heavily. If you got an acidosis, I'd investigate this side heavily. Of course, using your respiratory, also your ABG values from your blood gas there. So you just got to say, what else? Something else is causing the acidosis. What is it? Check their lactate. Everybody's heard probably of lactate in people that have sepsis. They have an infection that destabilizes the way the cell functions, and since the cell doesn't function like it should, it doesn't do aerobic metabolism like it should, so it does anaerobic metabolism, and it produces lactate as a byproduct. Some infectious process in the body is causing their cells to not function appropriately, and therefore they are switching to anaerobic metabolism, and the worse their infection is, the worse their cell function is going to be, the higher their lactate's going to be. That's how that works. Somebody overdosed in aspirin, salicylates, and that is going to displace the bicarb. Now they got less bicarb. So you just add up the numbers again, right? If you take everything now, except for the anion gap, but let's take everything. Sodium plus chloride, plus potassium, minus chloride, but in this one, instead of stopping here with the strong ions, we're going to add the bicarb, which remember on your ABG is called CO2. You got 140 plus 4 minus 108 plus 24. You got 144 minus 132. You got 12. Somewhere 12 to 16, depending on if you include the potassium or not, is considered normal. Now, what if we displace the bicarb? So the bicarb, because remember we added something else up here. It's gotta go somewhere. You gotta squish it somewhere. It's just like the brain. It's like when you herniate. The space has got to go somewhere. So what gives? Well, what's the easiest to move? It's all the hydrogen water associated things. So it's the bicarb. Bicarb goes out. So what does that mean? Bicarb goes down. Let's say this is 18. Now let's do this example again. 140 plus 4 is 144 minus 108 plus 18. Now we're 126. Right? So minus those two, we've got 18. So this is the opposite direction as the strong ion difference. 18. So when you have an elevated anion gap, that equals acidosis. And if for whatever reason you had a decreased anion gap, meaning you had more positives over here, let's just say our calcium level, right? It's like 8 to 10. Let's just throw that in there for some reason. So maybe this makes the whole positive over here instead of being 144. Maybe we have so much calcium it makes it 146. I don't know. And then let's use our normal number up here, 108 plus 24. Say the bicarb's all right. Get 132. Actually, I suppose what would happen is the hydrogen would have to go somewhere. So the hydrogen would go into the cells. So you would actually end up on, because the hydrogen goes on the cells, you'd go down in hydrogen, which means this would be unopposed, which means you'd have an elevated bicarb. Okay, so this number wouldn't be 132 actually. This would be 108 plus like 28. Okay, so now you got like 146 minus 136. Now you got 10. That's an alkalosis. And your body's going to try to compensate. When you have a ton of hydrogen ions, it's going to try to bind with bicarb, form carbonic acid, and then dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. Water's fine because it's got a pH of 7.0. So that's not going to do anything really to derange your body's pH. It's pretty neutral. Carbon dioxide, you're going to breathe that out. Breathe out. So a lot of your acidotic patients, because they have elevated hydrogens, right, pushes the formula this way and your body's trying to maintain some sort of neutrality, they'll blow off CO2 with a fast respiratory rate. And this is why it's so important to not limit the respiratory rates of patients that are acidotic and compensating, because if you suddenly decrease this, you have slowed down the formula going to this side. So the hydrogen is going to increase and increase and increase. Remember that tug of war? It's going to pull to one side more than it would normally. You can kill these patients that way. That might be the straw that broke the camel's back. So let's summarize generically, kind of more generally here. Body needs homeostasis. It needs equal neutrality, equal positives, equal negatives. Here are some positive and negatives that are common in the body. Magnesium, really important to oppose calcium. Calcium, really important to oppose magnesium, but also cell signaling, muscle contraction, heart conduction, and nerve impulses. And then hydrogen is really important in the hydrogen anion gap. The bicarbonate buffering system. Carbonic acid buffering system. Anions, negative charges. You've got your main chloride, which helps to oppose and keep this neutral. You got your phosphate for energy. You got lactate, which is produced as a byproduct when you use too much energy that your ATP can't replenish. Ketones, same thing but with blood sugar. Albumin, oncotic gradient, important in diet and regulation of fluid status in your body. And then bicarb, it's also negative. It's an anion. Bicarb's a weak base. because it binds to hydrogen, so it decreases the amount of hydrogen in the body. And it's weak because on this chart here, it only takes up a little bit of space as opposed to a lot. You add them all up on the left, you add them all up on the right. They should cancel each other out. The human body operates somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. When you have a tug of war going on, and it pulls too far to one side, the derangement gets so bad that you can't recover, and the whole gymnasium, the game is over. The whole thing becomes destabilized. That's what happens to the cell. Now, there's two ways you can get an acidosis or an alkalosis. You can get it from your strong ions that are very easily quantifiable because they're in every chems having complete metabolic panel. And then you can get your not so prevalent ones. So, you do lab work, you take an ABG, you say, is there a derangement in my pH as a reflection of what the hydrogen status is? And then the bicarb. So is there a pH derangement? Is there a bicarb derangement? So right away, you identify if there's an acidosis or an alkalosis. If the bicarb is low, well, that's because it went over to bind with all that extra hydrogen that's floating around in comparison. So when the bicarb's low, you got an acidosis. When the bicarb's high, you got an alkalosis. For the strong ions, if you shifted above 40, you got an alkalosis. If you shifted below 40, you got an acidosis. And I explained why using this example, right? If you keep adding sodium, the hydrogen's got to get out of the blood, which means in relation to it, you're going to increase your bicarb. So you're going to have less positive here, more positive here. This is a number taking away something else. So when this goes down and you're minusing a bigger number, the value decreases. Acidosis. The more common one is, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Let me go back. That was what would happen with chloride. Chloride would push away the bicarb, and then you would not have as much bicarb to attach to the hydrogens. You'd have more hydrogens. That's an acidosis. That is an example of hyperchloremic acidosis when you give a patient too much sodium chloride. It's got a value of 0. You keep pushing it to the left. This example, sodium, well, that pushes the hydrogen out of the blood. Less hydrogen in the blood is a base. Alkalosis. So in this one, you have a lower number minus maybe the same number. So instead of having 140 minus 10, or 144 minus 108, now you've got like 130 minus 108. So that is 22. Right? No, 32. 22. Whatever. The number goes down. That's acidotic. Number goes up, that's basic. The more common thing you see is something that isn't counted as often on these complete or these standard lab draws. So if all these numbers are normal, you gotta do a little digging. First of all, determine if they have an acidosis or an alkalosis. Most of the time it's going to be an acidosis. If the chloride's normal and these are normal, and the bicarb's not, you got to figure out what moved the bicarb. What caused this equation to move from one side to the other. It's probably going to be something in the acronym MUDPILES. So you test for ketones, you test for lactic acid, you check for salicylates if you suspect that maybe somebody ingested a bunch of aspirin, methyl, glycol, all that stuff, uremia, check their kidney function, do all the tests around the values that will support a diagnosis of why the values are the way they are. So to find the derangement, you got to do some investigating. And if you do your common stuff, boy, then you're really going to have to probably dig deep into like poisons, toxins, tumors, the more difficult things to diagnose. those people should get worked up better. And then your body will try to adapt as best it can using the bicarb left and right. And when you have a lot of acid, your bicarb will try to bind to it, it'll push it to the right. You'll get more H2O and CO2, and you try to breathe off your CO2. Don't try to correct those patients' respiratory rates, because you'll drive the formula back to this side. You'll wind up with more hydrogen, and then they'll get more acidotic when they were trying to compensate, and they could die from that. The farther they are on one side to the other, the easier it is. Just one little stiff wind might be enough to put the patient over the edge, and they could code. So be very careful with those patients. If they're so far over here on the peri-arrest acidosis, you got to give them bicarb. I don't think you can really give a patient acid. But those peri-arrest patients, or the ones that are arresting, you got to give them bicarb. It's the only thing, because the game of tug of war is so destabilized that any other med you give, it's probably not going to work. Right? It's like you keep throwing other players to help them, but they're tripping over the players that are all scattered across the floor. You got to pick those players up first. Right? So, what else we got here? There was one other thing I wanted to say. Going on an hour. Here's some ways that your body can accidentally wind up with an acidosis and alkalosis on its own. Prolonged vomiting. Hydrochloric acid. Remember we said hyperchloremia causes acidosis? That's the strong ion. This is 2. Hydrogen ions, increase in hydrogen ions cause acidosis. So if you're throwing up an acid and you're getting rid of your acids, that's going to shift your 7.35, 7.45, it's going to shift it over. You're getting rid of the acids, so it's going to shift it over. You're going to become more basic. If you're throwing up for days and you haven't replenished anything, you could get a metabolic alkalosis. What's the reverse of this? Well, what if your body doesn't produce bicarb, and then there's nothing to bind to those free hydrogen ions in the body now? Remember we said an increase in hydrogen ions is an acidosis, because the logarithmic scale is going to bring the pH down. That's all an acidosis is. And then if the charges get too out of whack, the whole membrane and all the cells become destabilized, unstable. So how can you not produce bicarb? I don't know. Maybe you have kidney problems. Where's bicarb produced? Probably the kidneys, right? Or the liver might have something to do with some of this as well. I haven't done recent research on this, but so what's another way you can get rid of bicarb? Well, what if it's just kind of in your GI tract, ready to go one way or the other? Because let's face it, there's a lot of ions and water that move in and out of the gut. So what if you're pooping it all out? What if you're pooping all your bicarb? Unopposed hydrogen ions, right? Acidosis. So people with days of diarrhea, they might have a metabolic acidosis. So maybe somebody with profound diarrhea for days or weeks or something like that, maybe they're breathing fast. So, and then when you check this patient, their standard lab work, you're going to see that their hematocrit is down because they've been losing water. They're going to be dehydrated. So, and then based off the history, you're going to say, okay, this patient's been having diarrhea and they have water problems. I got to fix the water. So you rehydrate them. Then you check more lab work. It's still abnormal. Well, what's causing them to have diarrhea? Let's fix that. Antibiotics. You fix that, then their bicarb system starts to work again. Supportive care, and hopefully they fix themselves. But if they're so bad that they're like peri-arrest even after you fluid resuscitate them, well, maybe you need to give them bicarb. That's an unlikely thing to happen in like a healthy adult, but maybe like, people that can't compensate very well hemodynamically, like your diarrhea type infants that have gotten rid of all of their bicarb through their watery diarrhea for the last 5 days, and they're super sick. Yeah, those patients. So, okay.